Oh, you know her?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. You can say hi there. Okay, so we'll just get this presentation started. I want to just introduce Dave Dyjur. He's there he is. He's a dietitian with several years of experience, and he's been a CDE for a long time. And every time I ask him questions, he has a wealth of experience to share with us. So thank you so much for coming today.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Esmond. Yeah, it's an honor. I just wanted to say that I didn't prepare like an actual presentation for you. So what I'd like to do is have it very interactive. So you ask me questions, and I've got the Diabetes Canada Clinical Practice Guidelines up here, and we can go through those, but please, you can read them as easily as I can read them. I don't want to just read off the slide here, okay? So I think probably most people who are in this course are pharmacists, is that correct? No? Who?
I don't know, like at least today.
At least today, okay. And I see Marie-Andre joining us by Skype. If this is the person I know, I think you're a dietitian, correct? If that's correct, then I'm not sure I can teach you anything at all. It's going to be general. It's going to be for people studying for the CDE exam, of course. Esmond, people here can't see the slides. Is that correct?
No, they can. They can see whatever's on the screen right here. So whatever.
Here?
Oh, I see.
The people here.
Shoot.
That's all right.
Yes.
No worries. Okay. We're going to.
We can open is this the slides from the guideline?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we can just,
Because we can.
If you want. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's going to be interactive. We're going to talk anyway. I'm not sure that you need to do that.
Is it the application CD?
Yeah, here. It's right here.
The slides on
The clinical practice guidelines.
So
Here you go.
guys open the browser.
Yeah.
Type guidelines.diabetes.ca. Guidelines.diabetes.ca.
That's all right. That's,
So which chapter? Which chapter?
so it is chapter 11. Chapter 11.
Chapter 11?
Yep.
Just the slides. So it should look just like this.
Yeah, nutrition.
So
Have you got it, guys?
Yeah, and the slides and your presentation. Just look like this.
Nutrition.
This is the reviews or the
Just for
slides?
personal use.
Oh,
Yep.
this is slides.
And then nutrition.
Finally.
Yeah. Chapter 11, nutrition.
yeah.
Just go personal use.
But seriously, we're just going to talk about them. All right. So the clinical practice guidelines in 2018 were revised, and I was very happy with the revision in Canada's Food Guide. I'm sure you heard about that news that Canada's Food Guide has been revised, and many of the guidelines on Canada's Food Guide are similar to the guidelines now in Diabetes Canada.
I thought they copied us.
Well, I was very happy because it was out of date, far out of date before, and now they're coming more into line with, I think, some good guidelines. So one of the things that you see within Diabetes Canada guidelines is a recognition of sort of ethnic foods and ethnic patterns of eating, and the importance of recognizing that there's many different ways to eat healthily, and you don't have to follow sort of a traditional, well, follow the old kind of thinking of what was a healthy diet. And Diabetes Canada has been that way for a long time. And so I can remember, now, I've written the CDE exam several times. The last time I did it by credit, so I can't tell you what it's like now, but I can tell you that there's a lot of focus on individualizing and recognizing that people need to have the guidelines individualized to them. And so you might get questions like that, you know, can a person follow, say, you know, a traditional Indonesian diet and still eat in a healthy way? Okay, of course, yes, there are many good things about that. There just might be a few additional things that you would recommend. There's a guideline on Ramadan as well, so people can fast for Ramadan with diabetes, except in certain circumstances that we recommend they do not. So high risk, they recommend they do not fast. For example, pregnant woman, someone with unrecognized, like hypoglycemia unawareness. It wouldn't be a very good idea. People maybe with very uncontrolled diabetes. So they're not understanding things very well. Maybe they're on insulin, they've got highs, they've got lows all over the place. It's not a good idea for them to fast. Okay. Yes?
Can we add to that people on insulin or sulfonylureas?
So I know that the guideline says if you're on insulin, if you're on like a basal bolus insulin, you're considered high risk rather than very high risk. So officially, people on basal bolus insulin should be discouraged from fasting for Ramadan. That's the official stance. My stance is as long as they're well controlled, they can do it safely. And I've got patients that I recommend that. So, you know, you need to think of what might be on the test versus people that you might see. The official guideline is that they're considered high risk. Sulfonylureas as well, considered high risk. I know. I don't think it's right, but that's what the official position is. So Diabetes Canada recommends that people with diabetes see a dietitian. Makes sense? Follow Canada's food guide, and like I said, Canada's new food guide, I'm very much in favor of. Low glycemic index foods are promoted, and do you know what are low glycemic index foods? Yeah.
Let me just review that a little bit.
Well,
I have an idea, like a basic idea.
Yeah.
Like, okay, for like the legumes, for example, it's you know, the rye, the whole wheat, rather than the processed ones.
correct.
For example, that's just an example.
I'm very glad that you mentioned that. So just as a general guideline that you could use if there's a question about low versus high glycemic index foods, the more processed the food is, the higher the glycemic index. So we're looking at foods that are closer to their whole natural state will be the lower glycemic index ones. So, you know, just as a comparison, then if you said an apple versus apple juice, easy to decide. The apple's lower glycemic index. If you've got cereals like steel cut oatmeal, okay, versus Cheerios made out of oats, well, the oatmeal is going to be lower glycemic index. Okay, there might be trick questions on there too, where you're asked to judge, you know, which of these foods, you know, which is the lower glycemic index, and it might be an apple versus whole wheat bread, and then you're kind of going, like, I don't know, like those aren't directly comparable. Do you know which it would be if you were to guess?
Apple?
The apple would be, yeah, absolutely. Again, you could think, which is more processed? Well, the bread, right? It's made out of flour, like it's wheat ground into flour, made into bread, and so it's more processed, yeah. Okay, if you keep that in mind, you'll be able to get probably all the questions on glycemic index.
What about when they compare two fruits or two vegetables?
Yeah. I hope they don't do that on the exam. I mean, that's getting too picky. But then if you've got a comparison, two different fruits, think the colder climate fruits are going to be the lower glycemic index. Almost
Yeah,
always.
yes, tropical fruits.
Versus tropical.
Mango and
Exactly.
oh, okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, the colder climate.
Is that always right? Or
90% of the time. So if you don't know it for sure, that would be your guess, but otherwise you're left memorizing 200 different foods. That's not practical.
colder climate is more.
Sorry?
Colder climate flu?
Correct. Yeah, that's correct.
That's a good tip, Dave.
That's not my tip.
Okay.
But it's a good rule of thumb.
Okay.
Yeah, easy to remember.
Mhm.
Obviously, when we look at people on insulin, we want to match the insulin to the carbohydrate intake. And why carbohydrates specifically? Why are we matching to carbohydrate intake? Yeah.
Because carbohydrates gets breakdown into glucose, and that's when insulin is released in the body.
Correct. So we're just replacing what the body would normally do. If you eat carbohydrates, broken down into sugar, into glucose, and then your body releases insulin to cover that glucose that comes from the food. Now, I don't know if they're going to get this picky, but what about protein? Can it be converted into glucose?
50%.
Yeah, it can be. Yeah, absolutely.
Someone's been studying.
I don't know if they'll get that picky, but they might. So just for you to know, and 50% is a good rule of thumb. Of course, it depends on what the protein is. It's more complicated than just the rule of thumb, but that works well. Potentially 50% gets converted into glucose, but protein, of course, is a muscle building nutrient. And so it depends on how much protein the person eats. And so if you're eating only the amount you need to replace what your body's using for muscle and so on, then none of it gets converted into glucose. So it is a little complicated. Now, where we see that it makes a big difference, again, I don't know if they'll ask this question, but just for your own knowledge, we've got so many people trying to follow a low-carb diet. So they're eating more protein, more fat, and low carb. And then we see that it has more impact on blood sugars.
So if they just eat more protein and they don't exercise.
Absolutely, your body needs that carbohydrate from somewhere. It converts the protein into glucose and uses that for energy. Right. Well,
So I have a question
yes.
regarding the glycemic index in this regard.
Yeah.
I don't know, if they came to that question, which one has more glycemic index? Or more sugars? Let's forget about the glycemic index. Which one has more sugars?
Yes.
Meat or milk?
I would always go with the carbohydrate food. So you know milk has lactose, which is so I would go with the milk. Now, to answer that question fully, of course, we need to know how much milk versus how much meat, right? But sort of equal calorie amounts, let's put it that way.
Okay.
So Diabetes Canada says that following Canada's food guide is a good idea, and they will, any of the questions regarding Canada's food guide will be based on the old one, right? Which has how many food groups? 4 food groups. Do you know what they are?
Fruits and vegetables.
Yep.
Grains.
Yep.
Meat and substitute. And
Yep.
milk.
And milk. And so the number of servings from each of those food groups depends on the age group, of course. I don't think there will be a question asking sort of how many for a 13-year-old girl or that sort of thing.
There hasn't been anything
No,
like that.
no, but just a balanced intake according to the 4 food groups. So there might be something like that. So they are fruits and vegetables, grains and grain products, milk and milk products, and protein foods. So yeah, so those would be meat, fish, and alternatives.
We've got a
question.
Question, yeah.
Excellent.
Just if you could just repeat the questions from the participants.
Oh yeah, sorry.
And then they can hear you, but they can't hear the when other
Can't hear
people
the
ask.
question. Sorry, I'll
Okay.
I'll try and remember to repeat
Sure,
the question.
okay.
Yes, thank you. So just now I was just reviewing the food groups from Canada's food guide. Okay. Now, Diabetes Canada recommends so much carbohydrate, protein, and so much fat. And carbohydrate that's recommended is 45 to 60% of the diet come from carbohydrate, 15 to 20% come from protein, and 20 to 35 from fat. And that fat that people get should be mostly healthy fats. And those healthy fats are? Healthy fats are unsaturated. Yeah. And so what would be examples of unsaturated fats? Olive oil, canola oil, sorry? Avocado oil. Yeah. So,
Oatmeal.
So oatmeal was suggested. Now that's a good source of fiber. But,
Oh, sorry.
yeah. So basically, we're looking at vegetable sources of fat will be the healthy ones, unmodified, that is non-hydrogenated, as well as fish oil. Yeah, omega-3 from fish. Omega-6 more from canola or yes, other vegetable sources of fat will be more your omega-6, omega-3 more so from fish. All right. You may be asked to estimate an amount of carbohydrate given a food label. And when you have to judge that, there are 3 important things to look at. One is the portion size, because sometimes they'll try to trick you with saying, you know, the food label says per yeah, whatever, 3 crackers, and the person's eating 6 crackers.
Yeah.
So you have to double it, of course. So you have to look at the portion size, the amount of carbohydrate, and that will be the total carb, and the amount of fiber. So the available carbohydrate will be the total carb minus the fiber, and that will give you the available carbohydrate.
Sugar and every the fat should be considered as a carbohydrate.
So the question is, should you consider the fat as a carbohydrate? And it's not, no. So when you look at the food label, you'll see calories, fat, cholesterol, sodium, carbohydrate. And then under carbohydrate, it will be subdivided, fiber, sugar. The sugar you ignore when you're looking at the available carbohydrate. You only look at the total carbohydrate minus the fiber.
And that's the amount of carbohydrates
So that's the amount of available carbohydrate, and that's the term that would be used when we're looking at, you know, how much insulin do you need for that food? It would be based on the available carbohydrate, not the total carbohydrate. So the important concept there is that the fiber doesn't contribute to blood sugar. It's important for other reasons, but it's not sugar. It's not converted into sugar.
The numbers written beside carbohydrate is the total carbohydrate number?
Yes, so where it says carbohydrate 12 grams in the example here from the slide, that refers to the total carbohydrate. And then the fiber, in that case, is only 1. I know it's not much, but still, it's different. If you look at the second example with the crackers, you've got 15 grams of total carbohydrate and 3 grams of fiber. So then, you know, you're looking at 12 rather than 15. And they'll try to trick you on a question like that if they include that. So there will be only one right answer, and you better be calculating the available carb, not the... Yeah, well, so sugar alcohol, I'm not sure if you'll get a question on that, but if you do, basically half of the grams of sugar alcohol will be converted into glucose in your body. So you would just count half.
But what if it's within the daily limit?
So if the sugar alcohol is within the daily limit, we still, if you're carbohydrate counting and you're wanting to know how much glucose are you getting from that sugar alcohol, you still count half of it.
Okay.
Yes.
But I think for the exam, you count it as 0.
Oh, for the exam, you counted as 0, you think?
I believe. For
Oh,
exam, you counted
that
as
would be
0.
very... Okay. All right.
But in real
So-
life, I think you count as half.
Well,
Yeah,
Alcohol is 0.
I believe so.
ignore
Yeah, I'll double check. I think it says somewhere in the guidelines that for insulin calculations, you would suggest 0. Yeah, but
So-
in real life is sometimes different from the guidelines. But
So-
for the test, go with the guidelines.
Yeah. So Esmond is just pointing out that for the exam, they are counting sugar alcohol as 0 carbohydrate.
So sorry, you were speaking about this slide. So it's 12 minus 1 should be 11.
Yes.
Correct.
And here 15 minus 3.
Yes.
But here's the number of crackers different. It's normal. For the grams, is different. This is for 23 grams and this for 20 grams. So we have to calculate percentage of that?
So the question is, with the food labels that we're looking at within the slides, cracker A is per 9 crackers, which weigh 23 grams. Now, don't consider that 23 grams at the top. That is telling you how much those 9 crackers weigh. The 9 crackers weigh 23 grams. That is not telling you how much carbohydrate is within those 9 crackers. Within those 9 crackers, there are 12 grams of total carbohydrate. 1 gram of that is fiber. So 11 grams is available carbohydrate. You don't look at the percentage at all. You don't have to be concerned with percentages.
So still, the cracker is number 8. Consider less carbohydrates than B.
So 9 crackers of cracker A would be 11 grams of carbohydrate. Cracker B, you only get 3 crackers for 12 grams of available carbohydrate. So you're correct. You're getting less carbohydrate from more crackers for cracker A. Now, yeah, I mean, they're obviously smaller crackers, right? You're getting 9 crackers. they're smaller.
Or maybe healthier crackers.
I don't know. But yes, that's how you read that. Well, so the next slide is just about healthy fats, and all right, we've got all that, I think. Yeah, so the unprocessed fats, so the unsaturated, not the hydrogenated, not the trans fat. will be the healthy fats. Yes.
It says daily values, the slide before. More than 15% is a lot. Daily value less than 5% is a little. So does it have any significance? What we're talking about?
So the question here is with the slide where we're looking at the labels, there's daily values listed at the very bottom of the nutrition facts. So what it says on the slide is that daily values greater than 15% means that you're getting a lot from that. And daily values under 5% means you're getting a little. I only would use that if I'm talking to someone about high blood pressure and I'm concerned about sodium. So if you look at cracker A there, you can see that sodium for the 9 crackers is 280 milligrams. If you wanted, like if you were counseling someone about blood pressure and they were trying to get a low sodium diet, you would say that those 280 milligrams of sodium are 12% of the recommended daily value of sodium. That is 12% of your total amount you should get for that day. Yeah. So what they're recommending here is that if it's something you're trying to limit, like sodium, that if it's more than 15%, that's a lot. You should probably make a different choice. You know, you can look at the percent daily value of other things as well, but to me, that's less important. Okay, we've talked about the healthy fats. Healthy carbohydrates, well, I think so healthy carbohydrates promoted would be low glycemic index ones, those that are higher in fiber, less processed. Well, as you can see, the next slide has low glycemic index carbohydrates, so low, medium, or high. I don't think I would discourage you from trying to memorize this, but just remembering the guidelines.
Thanks a lot. I was about to ask
you know what? I taught a class on glycemic index, and as the very first time I taught glycemic index, this is to patients, I printed a list of what the glycemic index of, I don't know, 300 or 400 foods.
Oh, wow.
You know, because there are these lists. Mm-hmm. And you know what? It just became a fiasco. Because why is this higher than this? Why is this lower than that? I mean, some things make sense and some things don't. And so just remember the overall rule of thumb. Yeah, well, so healthy dietary patterns, according to the guidelines, the Diabetes Canada guidelines, there's a few that are recognized. So the Mediterranean diet is one. The Nordic diet, are you familiar with that one? Nordic is similar to the Mediterranean, except that it substitutes some of the foods that are common in northerly latitudes. So the word comes, of course, you know, you think of Sweden and Norway and that sort of thing. But so instead of having, you know, more tropical fruits and vegetables, it's got more northerly fruits and vegetables, which would be healthier, really, mm-hmm. Anyway. But also, you know, fish oil, canola oil rather than olive oil. So, you know, sort of recognizing that you can still get foods more locally and still eat in a healthy way. So Mediterranean, Nordic, of course, vegetarian and vegan diets are recognized as a pattern within Diabetes Canada, as well as the DASH diet is recognized as being one of the healthier ones too. And another one that is called a portfolio diet. I don't know if you've ever heard of that one, but basically it's kind of a diet that is used for people with high cholesterol, but it's a very specific one. So it incorporates guidelines for high cholesterol as well as including nuts, low-fat dairy products. You know, a lot of these concepts are very similar. So it includes fruits and vegetables like they all do. So, you know, it's all very similar, I would say. But these are kind of the recognized patterns within Diabetes Canada. There are many others that I'm sure are just as good, just haven't been studied. Oh, there it is there. So people with type 2 diabetes, for sure, tend to be overweight. And so one of the guidelines, one of the nutritional guidelines we would recommend is that people who are overweight try to lose weight. That is, if they're over, if the BMI is over 25. Now, in practice, I mean, most people, you can tell without actually determining the BMI, whether they're overweight or not. And just a general guideline to try lose weight is a good idea in that case. And obviously, losing, if you've got someone who's 250 pounds, losing 100 pounds is not going to be very easy. It's going to be discouraging. And so we would recommend more so to try to lose 5 to 10% of their body weight. Okay, so 250 pounds, they can lose 12 to 25 pounds. That's going to improve their diabetes control a lot.
It's a more manageable goal for
Yeah.
people. If you tell someone, oh, you've got to lose 100 pounds, you know, it's very discouraging. I probably wouldn't go back to that person.
Yeah.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, just a slide below.
Yes.
It says dash diet.
Yes.
So it says grains, and then it says daily servings 6 to 8. So what does it mean? They need to eat 6 to 8 times or in a day?
So the question is about the DASH diet. When it says 6 to 8 servings of, say, grain products or whatever else it is, does that mean that you have to eat 6 to 8 times to have those grain products? No, it does not mean that. What it means is that the total for the day should be 6 to 8 servings of the serving size that's shown on the right there. So, you know, where it says grain products, it says 1 slice of bread would be a serving. So if you had, say, a meal, like you got a sandwich with 2 slices of bread, that would be 2 servings. That would be 2 of your 6 to 8 servings.
And in the bottom it gives vegetables. So along with grains, you need to have vegetables, you need to have fruits, or...
So the question is, do you need to have all of these things, the grains, the vegetables, the fruits, etc.? And the guideline within the DASH diet is, yes, you do have to have them all. They don't all have to be at the same meal, right? So you don't have to have grains and vegetables and fruit and milk all at the same meal. But you should, well, according to the guidelines on the DASH diet, they're recommending that you should get that much in the day.
So if you want to plan your entire day thing, you can get one from each and make the schedule.
Yes, so the question is, could you just get one from each maybe and plan the day, and at the end of the day then it adds up to the total amount that's recommended? Yes, that's how that DASH diet would work. Now, in practice, most people don't do that, of course. They don't plan out their whole day. And so they just sort of think more, well, if they're doing it well, they think more along the lines of, yeah, a variety of different foods at each meal, and at the end it kind of adds up, you know, because it could be all consuming if you tried to go through all of these things. Okay. Now, within the slides, I mean, there's a lot of detail about what these diets are, and I'm not going to go through all that detail. They won't ask you that detail.
Which one are you talking about?
Oh, I'm talking about, like, for example, slide 16.
Table 1.
Table 1, properties of dietary interventions. You won't need to know that.
Oh, yeah.
That's
Okay.
just way too much detail.
Sure,
Yeah.
It gives you an idea about which ones are like more comprehensive. Like, you know, like the DASH diets or Mediterranean.
Yeah.
You have like almost everything, all the benefits you want, rather than like more specific ones which has like less benefits. That's how I saw it.
Yeah, so I see the detail in slide 16 as being more for dietitians to be able to recognize, you know, the differences in different diets. All right, so I think slide 17 is actually a pretty important slide. So slide 17 talks about different strategies for different stages and types of diabetes. So if you've got someone with pre-diabetes, then what dietary interventions would be the most useful? Well, interventions that might lead to weight control or weight loss. If someone's overweight, are obviously going to be helpful. To achieve weight control or weight loss, you need portion control. Maybe low glycemic index carbohydrates are going to be helpful. So one of the, I'm not sure this point came out exactly, but high glycemic index foods need more insulin. So they need your body to release more insulin. And if you think in type 2 diabetes, that the cause is the pancreas is wearing out, not able to produce as much insulin. Well, if you're making it work harder, making it make more insulin, that's not going to be very beneficial for the pancreas. So low glycemic index foods, less insulin required, give your pancreas a bit of a break.
Okay.
And of course, physical activity to help with weight control, as well as, you know, with insulin sensitivity. Okay. If you've got someone with early type 2 diabetes, then of course the same thing about weight, portion control, the glycemic index. We would also then look at carbohydrate distribution. So, you know, there's not really, I don't know. Well, I guess we don't really know. There's not really evidence that distributing your carbohydrate through the day is beneficial for someone with pre-diabetes. But we know when you have diabetes, it is beneficial. So spreading that carbohydrate through the day, it's not all coming at one meal at supper and skipping breakfast, eating a small lunch, and then a huge supper. Okay, so for type 2 diabetes, that is not very helpful. As well, in early type 2 diabetes, you might look at one of those dietary patterns that we talked about. Like I said, I'm sure there are others that are just as beneficial, but those are the ones that have been studied, like the Mediterranean diet and so on. So if you've got someone with type 2 diabetes and not on insulin, well, what's the difference there? Yeah. It's about the same, I would say, as the early type 2. Yeah. So if someone's on basal insulin only, interesting. So the guideline that they say here is carbohydrate consistency would be the difference, I would say. So trying to be, well, fairly consistent is the way I would put it with carbohydrates. So fairly consistent at breakfast, at lunch, at supper, and snacks if they're having them.
Is it same amount of carbohydrate every day?
Yes. So is it the same amount of carbohydrate every day? Approximately. Yeah, approximately the same amount at each meal. Like the same amount at breakfast every day, the same amount at lunch every day, the same amount at supper every day, approximately.
What is the portion control?
So the question is about portion control. What does that mean exactly? And so so what I would say with that is if someone's following one of those dietary patterns, then they could, and they're trying to lose weight, they could try to keep it to those portions, those portion sizes that are recommended and the amounts. If that is not adequate to get some weight loss, say in someone who's overweight, I would recommend consultation with a dietitian to get more information about, cutting down those portions, or where they could control the portions.
I have questions. So, is there any information that how much should be our daily calorie intake, and then we can adjust our diet accordingly for a normal human being?
So the question is about portion sizes, like what portion amounts are we talking about for, like, is there a source? Is there someplace you can go to find out, like, what would be the correct portion amounts for someone? And that's where, well, for someone with, say, pre-diabetes or no diabetes at all, I would refer them to Canada's Food Guide. And so there I'm talking about the old Canada's Food Guide, where it does talk about portion sizes. Yeah. Or if they prefer, I would refer them to one of those dietary patterns that we talked about, where it does talk about amounts, portions. Yes. If someone has diabetes and they want more information, I would seriously recommend going to a dietitian and getting specific advice. Now, someone on basal bolus insulin therapy, our focus for food would be on carbohydrate counting in some form. And that's looking at either carbohydrate portions. So, we looked at that one table that talked about one slice of bread as being 1 grain portion, let's say. And you could get a whole list of foods. Well, we only looked at the bread, but there was a whole list of foods there. Or counting the grams of carbohydrate. So when we looked at the label, we talked about available carbohydrate, that's what we're talking about with carbohydrate counting. We're talking grams of available carbohydrate. And the way a person would use that in practice is that they would add up the grams of carbohydrate they're eating at a meal. And so let's just say they're eating 2 slices of bread for a sandwich. So that's going to be 30 grams of carbohydrate. And they're eating an apple. And let's say that they've got a scale at home. So they put the apple on the scale and it tells them that that apple's 23 grams of carbohydrate. So now we're up to 53 grams. And they have a glass of milk, and that's another 15 grams. So now we're up to 68 grams of carbohydrate. So adding that all up, then they would give insulin based on an insulin carbohydrate ratio. So that's kind of the most complex form of carbohydrate counting, but people may do it in other ways as well. They might do a simplified form and just say that each carbohydrate portion, one slice of bread, is one unit of insulin. So they're having, 2 slices of bread, they're having an apple, they're having a glass of milk, that's 4 units of insulin. So they might do it in a very simplified way as well.
And that's kind of like a common test question. They'll give you, okay, this patient is eating exactly what Dave said. His insulin to carb ratio is 1 to 5. How many units of insulin should he take? And then it lists like 5, 10, 12, whatever. And you would have to calculate that by yourself.
They will give
And
you
so-
ratio.
Oh, no,
Yeah,
go ahead.
so yeah, they'll give you a ratio, but they won't give you like, oh, the apple's 23, the slice of bread is 15. You have to know how much carbs is in each one. So they'll just give you 2 slices of bread, 1 apple, 1 milk. This patient's insulin to carb ratio is 1 to 5. How much insulin should he take? And then it'll be like 4, 8, 12, 16. Yeah.
So they do ask that. Eh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you
All right.
do have to
So-
know the carb contents of common foods like bread, like a slice of bread or apples or milk and stuff like that.
So-
So the question is.
So the question, yeah.
Oh, you go.
So the question is, well, isn't an apple 15 grams of carb? So within, like on the exam, they're going to use the general guideline for how much carbohydrate in different foods, which is that each carbohydrate portion is 15 grams of carbohydrate. So yes, they will use 15. They'll talk about a medium apple, but a medium, of course, I don't think people buy medium apples anymore. Even a pretty smallish apple that I had today was about that size, So if people are so for the exam, you're correct. I would count 15 for each serving.
I have a question.
Yes.
They have to give us the ratio, right? Carbohydrates to insulin. There's nothing by default. There is a ratio by default.
So the question is there kind of a default insulin carbohydrate ratio? And the answer is no, there's not. It's individualized per
Yeah,
person.
that's true,
So,
yeah.
so when you're doing the exam, they would have to give you that insulin carb ratio to be able to calculate that.
Good. People haven't studied.
Yeah. So the question is just about formulas that you can use to determine sort of a starting insulin carb ratio to estimate what you might use for that. I'm not sure that, they might ask you that question. So someone comes in, they're on so many units of insulin, what would be a reasonable insulin carb ratio to start with? And then they would use the 500 rule, which is 500 divided by the total daily dose of insulin to get you that carbohydrate number for the insulin carbohydrate ratio. So let's just say they're on 50 units of insulin, total daily dose. So you take 500 divided by 50 is 10. And so you would say the insulin carb ratio is 1 to 10.
I missed that. Sorry.
Sorry. So they're on 500, they're on 50 units of insulin, total daily dose. You would take 500
I take 500 from where?
from the air. This is the 500 rule.
Yeah, 500.
500
And
Divide-
divided on by 50, so it
Yes.
will be the ratio.
would be 10. Yeah. Well, so yeah, I just want you to understand it. 10 isn't the ratio. The ratio is 1 to 10 because we're
You
talking
mean one
insulin,
unit to 10
1 unit to
carbohydrates.
10 grams of carb. Yes.
Would be 10.
That's good questions.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Can I ask ask you a question? If
No.
they-
Sorry, you can ask a question.
I was confused when I was reading the essential that it said that on each meal it might be there are different carb ratio. It was a bit confusing.
Mhm.
Like what, like
Mm. Yes.
why? Like why would we? Like how do you know? Like are you assuming that in the morning they are resistant, so maybe the carb ratio is more, for example?
Okay. So the
Like,
question.
I'm not sure. Like
Mhm.
I don't know. It's just.
So the question is, there can be different insulin carb ratios at different times of the day. And how do you know?
Is this correct in real life? I have never.
Sorry?
Is this correct in real life?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, we can see that. Yep. So I'll answer that in several ways. One way is that when we start, we have the same insulin carb ratio for the whole day. We only individualize different meals if we see we need to. So our default would be that it would be the same insulin carb ratio the whole day. But sometimes through testing, we see from people that they need a different insulin carbohydrate ratio at breakfast, say, than they need at lunch and supper. And one of the reasons might be that they're more resistant to the insulin at breakfast time because of a strong dawn phenomenon, for example. That would be a very common case. Another reason we might see it is because of the basal insulin they're taking. So they might be running out of insulin at a certain time of day. For example, they're on Lantus at bedtime, and that Lantus is only working for them, say, 22 hours. And then they need a stronger insulin carb ratio at supper just to handle that evening time period. So there could be different reasons for it, but we start with the same insulin carb ratio for the whole day. We only change for a particular meal if we see we need to.
So you change it when you find that you are giving more units, so you change the ratio based on that?
So how do you know to change that ratio then? Because because you see it's not working. That is, people are testing before the meal. Let's say we're looking at supper. They test before supper. They give a certain amount of insulin for the carbohydrate at supper, but they're high at bedtime all the time. And I'm a dietitian, so I always check the food. Are they counting that carbohydrate accurately? Because if they're not, then obviously changing the insulin carb ratio is not the right strategy. So it's getting an accurate carbohydrate count that will help. But if they're counting it properly, then you know that the insulin carb ratio needs to be stronger at supper if you're seeing that it rises. Yeah, that's how you know. You just look at the numbers and see if it's working.
We use this to measure the amount of insulin that we need. I mean the bolus insulin, right? Only for bolus insulin?
Only for bolus insulin. That's a very good question. Yes, absolutely. So the insulin carb ratio is only used for bolus insulin. And yeah, I don't know. So I'm not sure if this is part of my talk or not, but anyway, if you've got someone who's using that sort of a complex insulin carb ratio, they often will also be using a correction factor to determine how much insulin to give. So they would say, this is how much insulin I need for carbohydrate. If my blood sugar is above target, I need additional insulin to bring me back down into target. And how much extra insulin you need would be determined by what we call an insulin sensitivity factor. So let's just pick the number 2. So let's say the insulin sensitivity factor is 2. Their target blood sugar is 7. They check their blood sugar and it's 11. Okay. So blood sugar is 11, has to come down to 7. So it has to come down by 4. You could say 11 minus 7 is 4. And each extra unit drops them 2. So you do 4 divided by 2. They need 2 extra units to bring them to target.
That's the 2 units of bolus.
Yes, correct. And the same thing, you would not apply that correction factor to basal insulin, bolus only.
So I have another,
Yes.
just to confirm, for the insulin ratio, it's not the total daily insulin. It's just the total daily insulin of the bolus.
So
Should be,
when you're applying that 500 rule, it's the total insulin basal plus bolus.
okay, what if
But-
I'm not applying this? Just like applying the what's in real life. The insulin to the insulin carbohydrate ratio.
So when you use the insulin carb ratio, you only use that for the bolus insulin. When you're looking at the total daily dose of insulin, you're counting both basal and bolus. So they're two different concepts.
And this leads us to another question.
Yes.
Which is that the ratio can be changing, as you said, and the ratio can be calculated in different ways. Like, let's say, for example, and the exam can come as just the units of insulin per day, and then you use the 500 if they ask for it. Or they can tell you the patient is using this amount of carbohydrates per day. Or in different question, they can just give you the amount of carbohydrates consumed per this meal, and the patient is using the grandial insulin only for this meal, and based on this information, you can just bring out the ratio. Is that correct?
So very good question.
Yeah.
So, and have you been to our workshops? No, okay. So the question is that, you know, insulin carb ratio could be determined in different ways. And it's correct. It could be determined in different ways. And probably well, I don't know, my least favorite way of coming up with an insulin carb ratio is the 500 rule, because it's just yeah.
Something rigid.
Yeah, and so you can use it, and they might ask a question about it. Absolutely. So you could also come up with an insulin carb ratio by looking at a detailed food record. So if someone comes in, this is the food I'm eating, they count up the grams of carbohydrate, and you can see that it's a really good record. It's complete. They've been accurate. And so you have some confidence with the grams of carbohydrate there. You know their total daily dose of insulin. You know how much bolus insulin they're taking, how much basal. And you can see in practice, even though they're maybe not thinking insulin carb ratio, you can see what that theoretical ratio might be, and they could apply that and try it. I like that method of determining an insulin carb ratio. Or you might just have, let's say, maybe one meal. So breakfast is always the same, and it's always 45 grams of carbohydrate. They always take 5 units of insulin at breakfast, and it works. So you know 1 to 9 works at breakfast time. Let's try it at lunch and see if it works there. Let's try it at supper. So, you know, there's different ways of coming up with that. I agree.
That's probably the most time-consuming method, but it's probably the most accurate.
Oh, it's the most accurate for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah. Okay. Well, I could see, you know, obviously, we don't have a lot of time left. I know people don't want to stay all night. Are there other? I'm just going to breeze through some of these and see if there's anything else I might highlight. But are there other questions? Yes.
Fructose and sucrose.
Yes.
How do they differ in affecting your glycemic?
So the question is about fructose and glucose. Sorry, fructose and glucose, sucrose, and how do they differ in their effect on the blood sugar? Yeah. So, there are different types of sugars, obviously, and the names end with O's. There are monosaccharides and disaccharides. So monosaccharides are like single sugar units. An example of a monosaccharide would be fructose or glucose. Now, sucrose is actually a disaccharide. So it's made up of two different sugar molecules joined together. And sorry?
Lactulose is a disaccharide.
Lactulose is, yes, another monosaccharide, I think. Is it a disaccharide? Okay. Lactose is the one I know better, and it's a disaccharide. Anyway, the sugar that affects your blood sugar is glucose, right? We always talk about blood glucose. So fructose, although it's a monosaccharide, is absorbed quickly, but doesn't directly affect blood glucose when it's absorbed. It's fructose. It needs to be converted into glucose before it will affect your blood glucose. And so when you think of things like fruit as being lower glycemic index, you think, why is that? It's sweet. Yeah, why is it lower glycemic index? That doesn't make sense. It's because the fructose has to be converted by your body into glucose, and that takes longer. It slows it down, and so it has less effect. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question completely, but well, sure, there could be other effects. Fructose also affects your triglyceride level very much, and so people with high triglycerides, of course, shouldn't be getting a lot of, high fructose corn syrup like they get from their pop that they drink and other things. Yeah.
I've got a comment that
yes.
Some people stay all night and listen to you, Dave.
Oh, please, please no. You need to get to your families too. I'm just flipping through the slides to see if there's anything else that I might. Interesting, I really like this guideline. I guess I hadn't noticed it as much before, but one of the guidelines says to try to prepare meals and eat together as a family. This is a good way to model healthy food behaviors to children and teenagers. And, I think that's really important. And we see that in Canada's new food guide as well, that there's some emphasis on, eating together as a family, cooking together, cooking more foods, really important. Okay, other questions? You know what? I just thought of something. I maybe glossed over it too much. Insulin carb ratio in practice. So Esmond mentioned this. Like you might get this question, like there's so much carbohydrate in this meal. You might have to add up the carb. They're using this insulin carb ratio. How do you use that? So let's say they're eating that 68 grams of carbohydrate. Their insulin carb ratio is 1 to 5. Well, how many units of insulin is that? How do you determine that?
13, 14.
Yeah. How do you get that? How do you get that? Sorry.
1 insulin.
Yeah. Okay. It's so obvious, right? But sometimes people. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And generally, you round down because you'd rather a patient be a little bit high than going into a low. Yeah. So generally, you round down for all those equations.
So it's 7.5. Use 7 units instead of 8.
Correct. You give 7 and not 8. Yeah.
Unless they've got a half unit pen.
Unless you have a half unit pen. That's true. There are half unit pens now.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, if there are no other questions.
One,
Oh, one
Yes.
more question.
so in exam, so let's say a question has, question focuses on different recommendation about diet. And then, so A, B, C all seems correct. And D says refer to dietitian. What option do you choose? Do you always refer to dietitian or do you adjust the sugar by yourself? Adjust the diet by yourself.
So-
Specific to the exam.
Yeah. So sorry.
Because in the recommendation, they say people with diabetes should receive nutrition counseling by a registered dietitian.
Yes.
So let's say A, B, and C gives you, like A, B, and C says that you adjust the diet based on Nordic diet, or B says vegetarian, and C says refer to dietitian. What option is the best option to choose in exam?
Okay. So the question is, what if you get a question in the exam, and the choices are, I could recommend a Mediterranean diet. Let's pick different choices. So I could recommend a Mediterranean diet. I could recommend the Atkins diet, or I could recommend.
C is like wrong.
Yeah,
Fast food,
exactly.
let's say
Or I
fast
could
food.
recommend Weight Watchers, or I could recommend a dietitian. Which would I choose? There are two responses there that might be
The best.
correct,
Right.
right? And so, which is the best
Mhm.
of those?
So do we refer to dietitian?
This one?
So I would guess how it would be how the question is asked, but for that question, I would say refer to dietitian would be the correct answer. Would be the most correct answer. Yeah. I've also got a question related to that. When introducing nutrition to someone who just is newly diagnosed, what do you usually start with? Because there's so much stuff to do, and they don't know what to do in that 1 hour. What do you generally start with?
So
1
the question
hour,
is, if you've got limited time, you've got someone newly diagnosed with diabetes, and you just want to give them something to go away with and be safe. Well, so again, I guess the way that question is asked, what would I do?
Mhm.
That what I would do is just quickly ask them, do they eat breakfast in the morning? And what do they eat?
Okay.
And do you eat lunch? And what do you normally have? And do you eat supper? And what do you normally have? And do you ever skip any of those meals? Now, if this is someone on an insulin secretagogue or is on insulin,
Mhm.
then it's a safety issue. I would recommend that they not skip any of those meals. If they're having any of those meals and they seem very, very erratic, I would recommend that they try to have, one of the things that they normally have. So let's say they have, some days for lunch, they have a salad and water, and that's it. Other days, maybe they have pasta. And, another day they have, so
random
it's
other things.
very erratic, sometimes high carbohydrates, sometimes almost no carbohydrate. And I'm just a little worried that it's going to be dangerous. Then I would recommend they try and pick one of those things and try to keep it consistent, at least until the next time I see them. Or if it was you, say, at least until they can get in to see a dietitian who can give them more information. But just try to keep it fairly consistent.
Mhm. Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah.
Okay. So if there's no other questions, I just want to thank Dave for coming, and just a round of applause.
It's an honor. Thank you. And I'm glad you asked me.
Okay, good. Good.
Well, I'll let you.
One more. I think we have one more question, actually. Oh, thank you. Okay.
Oh, okay.
No problem. Okay. So thank you, everyone. I'll upload this onto YouTube probably later this weekend.
And good luck to everyone.
Thank you.
So I'm just ending the presentation now, and see you next time.